In December 1776, 6 months after the Declaration of Independence, the euphoria of the event had faded. The Continental Army was in retreat and demoralized. It was a real low point. And this was even before Valley Forge. No doubt more than a few of those who celebrated so loudly only a few months earlier had what today we might call buyer's remorse. 6 months into this thing. It was in that context that Thomas Paine, whose earlier essay titled Common Sense persuaded many Americans to join the patriot cause, wrote another pamphlet, a little less well known. You'll recognize the opening sentence, but the pamphlet itself is The American Crisis. Common Sense was published in January of 76, and this was published in December of 1776. And it begins with these words. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Words of Thomas Paine. George Washington was so moved by the essay that he had it read aloud to his troops. And it was only 1 week later that we had the famous crossing of the Delaware and that tremendous military victory. So he did something to boost morale. We can thank Thomas Paine for that, and George Washington for his leadership in reading that aloud to them. Today, Paine's words resonate deeply with us. We see tyranny all around us. We may weep for our nation. Certainly there is cause to do so. Yet we must not shrink from our service to our country, which looks more like December of 1776 than July of 1776. We rightfully are appalled at the abuses of power we are seeing on a daily basis. The execution of alleged drug runners, not only without a trial, but without an arrest. The insertion of troops into a war without so much as a consultation with the Congress, let alone a declaration of war as required by the Constitution. And just this past week, what, in my humble opinion, and without the benefit of all the facts, to be fair, was the murder of a woman, a mom, a neighbor, spouse, for exercising one of the most basic rights without which our nation would have never come to exist, the duty to disobey. Of course, I speak only for myself. Unitarian Universalist ministers have what we call freedom of the pulpit. It's sort of the corollary to not having a creed for you. It's part of our culture that ministers do not necessarily represent the views of the congregations they serve, absent some process by the congregation itself, adopting a resolution, a statement of conscience, etc., from which the minister may speak. And you may have a different perspective on the events that I've described. That's okay. In fairness, those on the other side of the political spectrum from me might point out that President Obama's drone strikes, one of which killed an American citizen in Yemen, was just as unconstitutional as the more recent boat strikes. Fair point. So while it is fair and appropriate to talk about what's happening today, let's also enlarge our thinking beyond the immediate events and people that are driving the news today and reflect instead on how our faith calls us to resist tyranny whenever or wherever it may be found, regardless of which side of the aisle you may be on. The good news is that we are not writing on a blank slate. This next week, we will celebrate the birthday of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who I respectfully suggest offers some clues as to how we might move forward. Though nonviolent, Dr. King spent a lot of time in jail for disobeying what he called unjust laws. Much of Dr. King's thinking was influenced by Henry David Thoreau. For Thoreau, the duty to disobey a law was a question of personal integrity. He didn't lead marches or organize others for the common good. He asked simply that he not contribute to the evils he saw in the world. King, though, would take Thoreau's ideas to a whole new level. Now, Thoreau was an ardent abolitionist, and like many Unitarians of his day, he saw the Mexican War as a pretext to extend slavery in the United States by adding more slave states to the Union, which, take it from a history teacher, it was. What was most important to Thoreau was that he did not contribute to those evils, so he refused to pay his poll tax, which eventually landed him in jail. Didn't stay long, only one night. A still unknown person paid the tax for him. Some say it was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Others say it was his mother. We do know that when Emerson visited him at the jail, Emerson asked, "Why are you in there?" And Thoreau replied, "Why are you out there?" Thoreau wrote that if the government, quote, requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. I just love that language. That's from 1849. A counter friction to stop the machine. I've used that before, and I probably will again. It's a well I draw on a lot. Elsewhere in his essay on civil disobedience, Thoreau wrote, "If I devote myself to other pursuits, I must first see at last that I do not pursue them sitting upon another man's shoulders." And he's saying you don't have to fight every cause. Just make sure when you're living your life, you're not living it on someone else's shoulders like that. Now, in Stride Towards Freedom, King's account of the Montgomery bus boycott, King wrote about how Thoreau's essay of civil disobedience inspired him. Now I'm quoting Dr. King. "I remember how, as a college student, I had been moved when I first read this work. I became convinced that what we were preparing to do in Montgomery was related to what Thoreau had expressed. We were simply saying to the white community, we can no longer lend our cooperation to this evil system." So they just stopped riding the buses. But there was a lot of work then getting people to work and ferrying others. They created their own system. They walked the walk, sometimes miles, to get to where they worked because they couldn't take the bus. Just as Dr. King talked about the need for personal integrity in the struggle for civil rights, Thoreau talked about the need to actively work to dismantle any justice to which we have wittingly or unwittingly participated. Quoting Thoreau, "If I have unjustly wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, though I drown myself." I suggest that Thoreau is teaching us that it is not enough for us simply to denounce racism and model good behavior. Those of us who have benefited throughout our lives, from political and economic systems built on foundations of racism, must actively work to dismantle those systems, the remnants of white supremacy that still infect our society. Dr. King insisted that, quoting, one who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. Yet there is an entire category of folks who claim the mantle of civil disobedience who do not meet these criteria. Now, this little subcategory, I'm referring to proponents of so-called conscience clauses. Sounds good on the surface, but we should be opposed to these so-called conscience clauses, because what it says is I don't have to obey the law, right? And these are folks like pharmacists who refuse to give out birth control, for example, despite whatever the law may say. The latest example that I followed was military chaplains who said they shouldn't have to provide services to gays and lesbians because that contravenes their faith. I have no sympathy for these claims. If you don't want to provide the services required of pharmacists or chaplains by the people through their legislatures, then don't become a pharmacist or a chaplain. Nobody's making you do that. But if you choose to undertake that, you got to do what you got to do. Because we can't just tell everybody you can follow the law unless you just disagree with it. But we still have that duty to disobey. And where does that line go? Where does that line? You notice King said you have to be willing to pay the price. You don't go to the Congress and say, write an exemption into the law so that I'm okay. And then everybody else can do whatever they want to do. That's not what Dr. King said. Dr. King said, if you're going to do it, you be open about it. Say, this is an unjust law. You go to jail, you go to jail. And he did. That's the model. No one could say about Dr. King that he was advocating that conscience clause mentality. The best and most well-known expression of Dr. King's philosophy is found in his letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote in 1963. That was the spring and summer when Bull Connor used dogs and fire hoses to break up demonstrations there. While in jail, Dr. King received a letter from 8 prominent white clergy urging restraint on his part. And he used his reply to that letter to set out his thinking on the issue. He did not write it as a public document. It was not widely distributed until published as a pamphlet by the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization. He identified 4 steps in any non-violent campaign. 1, collect the facts. Make sure you know what you're talking about. Get the information. Negotiation. You talk first. Self-purification is number 3. Check your integrity. Check your motives. Clean your side of the street. And 4, direct action. And in our minds, we always want to go straight to the direct action. So do your research, understand the issue, work with your opponents when you can, and then when you can't, make sure first that your integrity and motives are beyond question. Then confront your opponents with action that compels them to respond. He went to great length to distinguish confrontation, which he affirmed, and violence, which he deplored. He didn't apologize for stirring things up, unsettling things, or creating disturbances, what John Lewis would later call good trouble. I like that. One of my protest signs, I have several, I choose from when I go to a protest. I've got one that says no kings. I've got another that says let's make good trouble. I've got another that says This is, what is it? This is Germany, 1938. So I choose my sign. One of my signs is good trouble. As King put it, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such a creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. End quote. Love the phrase create a crisis. Create a crisis. And then that creative tension. Creating tension. That's what it means to engage in social justice. Creating that tension that requires a response, but only after you've gone through those other steps. He rejected the notion urged on him by white ministers that blacks needed to allow whites to come to see his point of view on their own terms and in their own time. Quoting again, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. To do that, King started off with a simple distinction. We should obey just laws and disobey unjust laws. Fair enough. So what's an unjust law? Shakespeare might say, there's the rub. Fortunately, Dr. King offers some guidance by which we might agree whether a law is unlawful or not. Again, from the letter. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. He wrote. And then he further specified an unjust law is a code that the majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. Code inflicted, he added, it is a code inflicted on a minority that had no part or in enacting or creating, because they did not have the unhampered right to vote. Now, these are much more legitimate, objective criteria by which we may justify civil disobedience than anything we saw in the past week. Between Thoreau and King, we now have several criteria for disobeying the law. From Thoreau, we get when it requires you to be an agent of injustice to another. And from King, we get when the law is not binding on those who made it, and when those affected by the law had no opportunity to participate in its making. I think that sort of resonates with us. We'd probably be there. You probably would have thought that before the service, but now they're stated in ways we can articulate. We can say these are these principles, right? And we can justify in conversation, in that negotiation, in that dialogue, what our criteria are for disobeying an unjust law. Now, we recently had a lot of debate about the duty of members of our armed services to disobey the law. The Uniform Code of Military Justice requires service members to obey lawful orders. And that's how it's written in the code, by the way. The word lawful is in the code. They have to obey lawful orders. That is, its duty is the duty to obey is limited to lawful orders. It's implicit that you don't obey unlawful orders. Doesn't say it that way, but it's implicit. The code, however, doesn't say how service members are supposed to make that decision. And we can't just have them all read letter from a Birmingham jail. There's a few people I'd like to hand it to. Don't get me started. But in the Department of Defense, and I'm still calling it that until the Congress says otherwise, by the way. In the Department of Defense Law of War Manual, which has always been its name, section 18.17.2, if you want to know. There is more guidance. It says service members must refuse to disobey orders that are, quote, manifestly unlawful orders, including orders to commit war crimes, end quote. Of course, we don't want to put service members on the battlefield in the position of making these kinds of decisions on the spot. It's not a bright line. Close calls should benefit the service members. Some calls are not so close. And I respectfully suggest that blowing up suspected drug boats is one of them. But I didn't write this down. I would not impose that on the drone operator who's probably sitting in their center in Las Vegas. That's where they control all the drones. And some sergeant. It's the person who says, we have obtained a legal decision by the Office of Legal Counsel, the Department of Justice. This has been ordered this way, and we've examined it closely. I'm not going to have the sergeant say, well, my legal analysis differs from yours. But I'll take on the people who had that pretentious legal analysis in the first place for what is manifestly a war crime. Where you draw the line, again, can be a little fuzzy, but some people are clearly on one side, some people are very clearly on the other side in terms of accountability. On a macro level, the United States still works. I'm proud to be a citizen. Both the Constitution and our courts are doing what they're supposed to be doing most of the time, even if we disagree. Our republic is stronger than it looks on the surface these days. Still, we are not without our faults, not beyond improvement. We must remember that most of our founders owned slaves, disenfranchised women, approved the genocide against Native Americans. Yet, except for prohibition, every amendment to the Constitution has enlarged our society, expanded our freedoms to others whom the founders excluded. And that's a good thing to say about our country and our nation. Unfortunately, there are many people today who seek to narrow those freedoms for women and immigrants, religious minorities, among others. Those who would return us to our founding too often forget how flawed it was at our birth and how far we have come. I can think of no greater cause for civil disobedience than to return to our distribution of social justice to the level it was in 1787. If that becomes the machinery of our government, as Thoreau might say, let us commit ourselves now to be the counter friction that stops that machine. Let us find creative ways to create the kind of crisis that will bring about the changes we seek. Since I did not begin with a poem, as I often do, I'm going to close with one that may serve as a warning to us, titled Harlem by Langston Hughes. I see some nodding heads. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, the crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? May it always be so. And blessed be.